Hi, and welcome to Clean Education's Research to Practice podcast, where we talk to education experts from around the world about their latest work and bring their fascinating findings out from the journal pages and into your classroom. I'm Jessica Hammond, founder of Clean Education, and today I'm very excited to be talking to Katharine Pace Miles, assistant professor in early childhood education at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. Her research focuses on many different areas of literacy instruction, including orthographic facilitation, sight word learning, assessment, and developmentally appropriate, highly engaging, explicit literacy instruction for emerging readers. Dr. Miles also works closely with the New York City's Department of Education to support literacy initiatives and research that impact the city's most vulnerable students. Today, we'll be chatting with Dr. Miles about her extensive work in the area of literacy instruction and intervention. Dr. Miles, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
The areas of research that you've been focusing on have a common thread in terms of building practitioner understanding of so many of the elements that contribute to successful reading acquisition and literacy instruction. So can you tell us a little bit about how your interest in these areas of literacy kind of got started and how it informs your understanding of what teachers need to know about teaching literacy?
Sure. So I started as a kindergarten teacher years ago, and I was later a third grade teacher and then a learning specialist. And as a learning specialist, I would have these large caseloads of students who were struggling with the ability to read in the older grades. And it was there that this passion around, like, how does the mind acquire the ability to read? That's where it came from. And during that time, I stumbled really upon Linnea Airey's research. And I was fortunate enough to reach out to her. I had been working on my master's in educational psychology, and I was very fortunate to receive a fellowship to work with Linnea Airey at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And that was a real transformative time for me, from kind of walking out of the education realm and into the psychology realm, that the experimental psychology realm, and getting this training I needed in order to deeply understand how words are securely stored in memory. And so through this training with Linnea, I was able to take a deep dive into orthographic mapping and orthographic facilitation. Some of my early research involved orthographic facilitation around vocabulary learning. And I ran a study with adults, so English language learner adults. And more recently, I have some work with colleagues out of the University of London, where we did a review of the research on orthographic facilitation. So that is very deeply an interest of mine, having worked with Linnea. But while I was working on my dissertation and my pilot study leading up to my dissertation, I went back to my education roots, my teaching roots. And I have always been fascinated by this sight word reading phenomenon that goes on in schools. Yeah. So typically in schools, there's a lot of flashcarding going on in the early years, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And it's called sight word reading. But in research, we know that sight word reading is not flashcard reading. Sight word reading, from a researcher standpoint, is the process by which the process by which graphemes and phonemes are analyzed in order to securely store words in memory. In the educator realm, sight word reading is this idea of an instructional approach, like flashcarding.
Right.
So in my dissertation with Linnea Airey, I looked at high frequency words, so words off of the Dulcian-Frye list, and I ran an experiment where I looked at different types of words on those lists. So content words, like the word house or crab, versus function words. So those lists are full of function words, and those words are context dependent. So they're conjunctions, prepositions, auxiliary verbs, irregular past tense, like the word with, of, kept, words like that. So I looked at different word type and how you would present them, whether in isolation or embedded in a sentence. And I thought I walked away with some really interesting insights into how you present words, what information about the word's identity is acquired by a young student, and what difference it might make if you are learning a content word versus a non-content word or a function word.
And did you find that when sight words were presented within a context of content, that they were more readily learned or more easily remembered?
Yeah, so what I learned is that function words were much more difficult to learn how to read, to spell, and to use. And this is really interesting because with kindergarten, I worked with 80 plus kindergartners for this study. And in the words that we were using in the function words on kindergarten word lists, those words are very simple, or for adults, we would think that those are the shortest, simplest words on the list. And yet they were the most difficult for these young students to read, spell, and use. And so there's something about these words that make them more difficult to secure in memory.
I really appreciate the focus on that because I think it points to the importance of teacher background in terms of understanding of linguistics, grammar, and the structure of language, and how you could see a common thread in terms of the difficulty of student sight words. And I mean, I was a reading teacher myself, and I knew that students continually struggled with like was, right? But I kind of thought it's because it's obviously irregular. But the consistent struggle with those seemingly simple, short, if irregular words actually has a linguistic grammar embedded reason to it, which is pretty fascinating. And with that awareness, we're able to better support instruction because we can put it within a context of why a student may not be grasping them as quickly, because they're really not tied to any kind of meaning in any specific way. They're helping words.
Exactly.
It's fascinating.
And you can imagine too, for a young student who's learning English, how even more complicated this situation is when they're presented with a list of words that are full of these context-dependent words, and yet they're being asked to read these words in isolation, which happens a lot actually in ESL classes, where students, and it's all with great intention, right? Teachers are trying to get these students caught up, quote unquote, right? And they're thinking one of the best ways to do this is to quickly move through lists of words in an effort to store them in memory as quickly as possible. But that's what we know is that I could say some of my research has shown, and a lot of Linnea's work has shown, that this is not the most effective way to do this, to help these students.
And what is the most effective way?
Well, what we know from years of research from the field of reading science is that having a strong foundation in phonemic awareness, having strong letter name, letter sound knowledge, and then when presented with words, analyzing grapheme-phoneme relationships in individual words, and repeated exposure and practice analyzing those relationships is what has been demonstrated to be the most effective way to store words in memory.
And this process is called orthographic mapping in the literature. And I think it's something that's a little bit confusing to teachers if we're not embedded in research. And here's where we talk about the research to practice gaps sometimes. Can you help us bridge that by breaking down the word orthography? I mean, let's just start with that, because you had actually mentioned two things related to orthography. You talked a little bit at first about orthographic facilitation. And so for the layperson or a teacher that's not familiar with orthography, tell us what orthographic facilitation is, and then what orthographic mapping is, and how we can better use that understanding to improve our instruction.
Sure. So orthography, if we start there.
Start with that.
Okay, so if we break that down, ortho means correct, right? And you can think of orthodontist, like the correct way your teeth are positioned. Same thing goes with the spelling of a word. So ortho is the correct, and grapho is grapheme. And we know grapheme are letters, right? So the correct letter sequence of a word. So the word brain, B-R-A-I-N, it's not B-R-A-N-E, even though that sounds the same. That's not the correct string of letters for that word.
Not the correct orthography, in other
Correct.
words. Okay.
Correct. Yes. Exactly.
And then orthographic facilitation means?
Sure. Presenting, so Linnea and others have run these experiments where they had the spelling of a word available. And whether the participants in the studies were explicitly told to look at the spelling or not, the words were just there and available. And when the spelling was available, it facilitated better storage of the word, the spelling, the pronunciation of the word for sure, and the meaning. I have a publication out on this where the meaning oftentimes is also supported through having the spelling available.
Okay, great. So seeing the correct spelling facilitates the vocabulary learning or potentially sight word learning. And then orthographic mapping brings us to the one that you most recently talked about. So just briefly break that down for us.
Sure. So I think I would distinguish it here as orthographic mapping is a cognitive process. The facilitation piece is whether you use that spelling that's available to you or not in that moment. You know, what we've seen is that if you use it, that's a facilitatory effect of having orthography. Orthographic mapping, I would think about it as the process of storing words in memory for later efficient retrieval by analyzing the letter to sound relationships in that word.
Okay. And so is it possible to give me an example of what that would be in terms of analyzing the sound to grapheme relationship? What's an example of that for a teacher trying to put this into practice?
Sure. So let's use a word where there's not a one-to-one correspondence. So one-to-one correspondence very simply would be the word cat, C-A-T, and we know that the C maps onto the K, the A maps onto A, and the T onto Ch. So I said, let's not use a regular example. Let's use the word whale, W-H-A-L-E. What's interesting there is that there's 5 letters in the word whale, but there's actually only 3 sounds. So the W-H, let's do the.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we have W-A-O for whale. So there's an issue here, right? We've got all these letters, more letters than we have sounds. So the WH, what you could work with students on is considering which letters are going to make these 3 sounds. The WH is going to make the W sound. The A with that E at the end, that's a combo that's going to make the long A sound. And then the L comes on, and that the L makes obviously the L sound. And so there's this moment for students who are just learning about the digraph WH, or they're learning about the E at the end of words, making a vowel say its name, the bossy E, the magic E, whatever it's called in that curriculum. Those are 2 grapheme phoneme correspondences that have to be learned by a student and applied to the word whale.
Got it. And then the idea being that students will start to make a map of those correspondences for later retrieval and for better fluency in the end.
Exactly. And it'll take multiple exposures to that word. And you can see the progression of this mapping often through students' invented spellings. So that they might just start with representing the word whale with a W and an L. And then it may progress to a W-A-L. And then eventually the digraph WH may appear. Eventually the E at the end of the word, which supports the A, may appear.
As they become aware of this mapping of representation of what the correct spelling should be.
Yes, I would say as the representation of the word in memory becomes more secure.
Okay.
And this is all Linnea Airy's theory of orthographic mapping. I'm happy to be able to explain it, but Linnea Airy gets all the credit.
Well, it's amazing and very important, I think, because so often as teachers, we're teaching reading because we know these are processes that we want to get the students to, but we don't always realize what happens neurologically as they proceed through that process. So I think it helps because if a student is stuck in a particular area, we can pinpoint where they need more support potentially.
Exactly. I would recommend listeners too to look into Lene Airey's phase theory,
Okay.
which I know you know, and it's an excellent roadmap for working with emerging readers and spellers on how they're going to develop secure storage of words in memory. They're going to move from this pre-alphabetic to a consolidated alphabetic phase.
Great. We'll be sure to link that in the show notes then as well. So you have an article entitled that kind of takes a different tack and actually researches a specific intervention that's being done in New York City schools. And the article is entitled Reading Rescue, a follow-up on effectiveness of intervention for struggling readers. Can you tell us a bit about the background behind this article and why you took this area of research on?
Sure. So through my work on sight word reading, quote unquote sight word reading, I became very deeply interested in this research to practice connection. I enjoy doing more of the experimental psychology work, or even when I was able to conduct studies in schools, I was conducting them in the back of a classroom or in a room off to the side or in the hallway. And I wasn't really embedded or immersed into the instruction going on in the classroom. I found very interesting things about these sight word lists, that they're much more regularly than otherwise considered. And that's information that I can give to teachers to use. Reading rescues it became of such interest to me because it was an opportunity for me to consider and research a program that is happening in schools in New York City 5 days a week. And the individual who developed Reading Rescue, Dr. Nora Hoover, she was retiring, and she was interested in having the program evaluated, and then they wanted the program to have continued academic oversight because they really want the program to be using the most recent research out of the field of reading science. And so my first opportunity with Reading Rescue was to conduct some sort of evaluation of the program. And maybe I could tell you a little bit about what exactly the intervention entails.
Yes, please.
Okay, so Reading Rescue is a 30-minute one-to-one intervention. It's conducted 5 days a week, and it is for first graders who are at risk for reading failure. Right now, it's provided to students in New York City, and all of the supports for this program are put forth by an organization called Literacy Trust. Literacy Trust conducts all of the professional development training for teachers on how to conduct the intervention in their schools, and they provide all of the support throughout the school year on evaluating the fidelity to the program, assessment support, and anything these instructors would need.
Okay.
And that's a really big part of this, is the fact that this is not Reading Rescue people who are coming in to do the intervention. Okay. The program Reading Rescue, which is trained and supported by Literacy Trust, we train individuals in schools, whether it's a certified teacher or a paraprofessional. And actually, Dr. Hoover designed this to predominantly work with underutilized staff in schools. So paraprofessionals are an outstanding group of individuals who know the students and know the parents really well. And they have tremendous impact with these students, but they haven't been given some sort of skill around literacy instruction. Yeah. And so Nora said, why don't we give these individuals professional development on how to do this program? And what she developed was an outstanding thing for both students and paraprofessionals to receive this training.
Can you tell us a little bit about the aspects of the intervention in terms of kind of the key points we were just talking about? We were talking about the things that teachers need to know, specifically with sight words, but if we're looking at the science of reading on a greater scale, how does this intervention align with those elements that we have come to know are commonly associated with what we call the science of reading?
Sure. So what I loved about what Dr. Nora Hoover did is that she revamped key aspects of something we all know to do as teachers in the early years, which is guided reading. So she took a classic guided reading template and she incorporated what she knew at that time. She was at the University of Florida, which we know is a powerhouse of reading science. And she, along with her colleagues, thought through how to embed reading science into a classic guided reading, or more like a classic reading recovery format.
Okay.
And so she incorporated Linnea Airey's phase theory. She incorporated much more instruction on letter names, letter sounds, phonemic awareness, and phonetic elements. She wanted that to be a through line through this intervention. Also during the writing part, so there's a lot of fluency building, fluency reading. There is a specific section just for explicit systematic phonics instruction during the intervention. And there's also a component of the lesson that comes right after that, which is writing instruction, that also emphasizes the phonetic elements being learned during that session, and it spirals back to previous sessions and practices those grapheme phoneme units. She married all of this with what we know around vocabulary learning, fluency practice, and comprehension checks, and she kind of put it all together.
And embedded in it, importantly, is also training for teachers who are teaching it that go along with this curriculum. So how in-depth is that training, and what just basically do those teachers learn in that PD?
Great. So the individuals who are going to conduct reading rescue in their schools, they're given 8 days of professional development, broken up over 2 years. And the professional development is grounded in the 5 pillars from the National Reading Panel. So and you have to remember, these are individuals who oftentimes are not certified teachers, but what we also know is often certified teachers don't know about the 5 pillars of literacy from the National Reading Panel. So it's grounded in that, and we connect each component of the lesson, the 5 components of the lesson, we connect it back to the pillars.
Okay.
So in part 1, where the students are doing fluency practice, we connect that back to the 5 pillars, and we talk. So there is this very practical aspect of the professional development where they're learning what exactly needs to be done during that part of the lesson. But there's this larger theoretical framework that we use in the reading rescue trainings to ensure that instructors walk away with a larger body of knowledge around the development of literacy in young children.
Perfect. So what were your findings in this study?
Oh, great. So I was fortunate to investigate a cohort from 2016, 2017, but I'll actually go backwards a little bit because there were 2 really important evaluations of the program before mine came. And the 2 that came before mine were much more rigorous, actually. So Dr. Hoover believed very strongly in continued evaluation of her program. I just want to emphasize that because that's a big reason why I feel comfortable being associated with Reading Rescue. There's lots of other reading programs out there that, for whether they know they should or not, just don't have an evidence-based backing to them. They may be grounded, they may be research-based, but having an evidence base is actually quite difficult to acquire.
Yeah.
And takes years to build up this body. So in 2004, an independent evaluation was conducted by the University of Indiana. They used a randomized controlled trial design. They found that students who received Reading Rescue performed significantly better on the Gates McGinnity. And the effect size there was, I think, 0.33233, which is a moderate effect. But what's interesting to note is that the evaluators stated the control group students may have benefited from having teachers in that school trained in Reading Rescue.
Wow, that's interesting.
Right? So which is kind of a beautiful thing to have happened. Yeah. They did look at students by the end of the year, and the Reading Rescue students made much greater gains when you look at scale points. I think at the end of the intervention, they were 11 scale points higher than controls on the Gates. But by the end of the school year, that gap had widened so that the Reading Rescue students were actually 22 or so points, scale points higher than students who received the controls. So that's just a different way for us to talk about the findings.
Okay.
Linnea Airy and her colleagues evaluated the program in 2007. They also used a randomized control trial design, but as happens in dealing with schools, is their randomized control trial was compromised because the district assigned some of the students into a small group intervention that's commonly used. And what Linnea did in that study, though, is she pivoted and she said, okay, we still have enough students where we can evaluate randomly assigned students from reading rescue into the business as usual control group. And we can look at students who received reading rescue to students who received the small group assigned intervention. So it actually, even though the random assignment was compromised, it became a much more interesting study, I think. And she found that students who received the reading rescue intervention performed significantly better than students who received this small group and the control. And the effect sizes is what we're really interested in. The effect sizes in her study were around 0.7. So it's, that's getting us into the large effect size world of Cohen's D. And reading rescue students reached average levels of reading. So they reached benchmark, whereas the small group students and the control group students did not. Another, and I know I'm rambling about the findings, but this one is so important, and maybe I should have even led with this one. Paraprofessionals tutored as effectively as reading specialists. And when they looked under the hood of the individuals who were providing the intervention, and that's what they found, that these paraprofessionals could conduct this intervention as well as the reading specialists. The only thing they didn't do as well was non-word decoding. And they just needed more sessions. And so one thing that Reading Rescue has done based on that finding is we've really beefed up the supports that we give instructors around decoding words, not just non-word decoding, just on supports for how to decode words. And this goes back to grapheme, phoneme, correspondence training.
Well, it points to one of, are you hearing reverb on your end or no, it's okay?
No, it's okay on my end.
Okay, great. So it points to one really interesting thing that I was going to ask, which is, do these elements of research inform any kind of tweaks or pivots or changes on the part of reading rescue, because they have such a strong research to practice connection? And you answered that in terms of the training. Are there any other ways?
Definitely. That's a great question, because actually in the evaluation that I did that was published in 2018, we found, again, these incredible pre to post foundational skill findings. We compared our effect sizes to what Linnea had. The effects were there. We did this to see if the program was effective 11 years later. And after lots of change, Dr. Hoover being on the brink of retirement and then retiring, does that change the way the program is conducted? So what we found is it's demonstrated to be equally as effective, but what we followed up on were the assessments that were being used. So from Linnea's study, Reading Rescue recognized that they needed to provide more explicit support for instructors on how to teach grapheme phoneme correspondences. And I've worked with the program on how to make that a more robust part of their curriculum. And from my evaluation, what we found was that we needed to pivot on assessments. We needed more assessments that were valid and reliable so that we can conduct evaluations on the program every year, not just every 11 years when you have to go through rigorous research, like getting outside evaluators to come in. So that was a huge pivot. So Reading Rescue did just that. And we also had findings where we looked at student, tutor, and school variables and how those variables predicted success in the program. And based on those, I've also made recommendations to the program about certain schools need more support than other schools. So the number of site visits that you do, you may be able to differentiate it based on the number of years the school has had the intervention, or percent of students with who receive free and reduced lunch at that school, and other variables like that, like how large the school is. So Literacy Trust, who supports the schools, was very appreciative of these recommendations, and they're following up on them.
I bet it improves their practice considerably. And so what classroom implications are there from the work that you did on this study?
So my interest right now, coming out of this work, is on how schools can consider the spine of their curriculum. And the spine of their curriculum, in my opinion, and I know the opinion of other individuals who research the acquisition of reading or the field of reading science, is that that spine in the early years needs to be strengthened around phonemic awareness and phonics.
Mm.
And what I understand from schools, I work with a lot of schools here in New York City, and they've invested a lot of time around professional development and a ton of money on certain curriculum. And they may not be able or willing to get rid of what they have. And so what I support those schools in doing is supplementing, but really the supplement isn't this outside supplement that I say attach on. I actually say go into the middle of that curriculum and have a through line throughout your day, throughout your year, and across the grade levels that where the spine is this phonemic awareness and grapheme phoneme or phonetic element component. And that should be the driver through everything. So take guided reading, like Reading Rescue is the perfect example of this. Take your guided reading approach that all these teachers are trained in, take the workshop model that you're all trained in, but please go with this phonetic elements first approach and make sure that in those early years, that's what's driving through guided reading, morning meeting, and all of the other approaches you use, shared reading, it can drive all of it.
Because once those phonemic awareness and phonetic elements are solid, they act as a foundation to the rest of the work that guided reading can support: fluency and vocabulary building and comprehension. But without those core elements, it won't be as solid. It won't be as firm.
That's exactly right. And we have to acknowledge that in kindergarten and first grade, we have to spend more time on that foundation. If we don't, then we have third through fifth graders who are trying to build up a foundation while they need to read high level content for their grade level. And I think we do a great disservice by not building that foundation in kindergarten and first grade.
I think it really points to an important barrier within the teaching field as well, that teachers may not be cognizant of the explicit element of what enabled them to start reading. So, and on top of that, they may have not received this training in their pre-service instruction as well. So where should a teacher find themselves in an in-service situation where they're currently teaching, they're becoming aware of the elements of the science of reading that are critical for supporting the student's foundation? Where can they turn to gain support in learning more about this so they can embed these critical elements into whatever curriculum the district is providing?
Absolutely. Well, first they should bolster their knowledge of the linguistics of the English language. And there are professional development programs out there. And there's also one-off webinars that can do a tremendous amount of knowledge building for instructors. I want to give a shout out to Glean. You guys have some great webinars that they can use. Louisa Motzes has the letters curriculum that you can use. The Reading League, now we have the Reading League, which has links to many organizations that provide these webinars. Another is Spell Links. And I get emails, actually, it's interesting you're asking me this, because I get emails a lot because I think I'm a professor in New York City who teaches the development of literacy. I'm often asked if we have a literacy program. And it breaks my heart, we don't. You know, when teachers are trained in the grade level that I work in, early childhood, they receive one course, my course on the development of literacy, and that's it. Yeah. And so I often refer them to these webinars because they often are better than some of the literacy programs that are available in our country.
Well, that is an interesting area of future exploration. I think it points to an area that has potentially room for improvement, and just time spent on figuring out why that is and how we can improve those areas in terms of in-service and pre-service education and training of teachers in the area of literacy.
Yeah,
Really
there's lots of great, there's researchers, academics across the country who have evaluated teacher ed programs, as you know, and have looked at the dearth of knowledge that pre-service teachers are being trained in around the science of reading.
Which is really interesting, especially because early childhood is focused so much on literacy. So there is a disconnect there that I'd love to delve further into someday.
Yeah, very much so. Yes, yes.
So tell me a little bit, and I think you kind of mentioned it in what you just spoke about, but are there any future areas of research that you're focusing on, and things that you're thinking about moving ahead?
Oh, yes. So I've become very passionate about this alignment of practice to what we know about from the field of reading science. My sight word analyses, this 419 word sight word analysis I worked on with my colleague Devin Kearns, that led me to analyze word walls that are in classrooms. I say that they take up a tremendous amount of real estate in a classroom, and are we using them as effectively as we can be? So I've worked with another colleague, Mary Dahlgren. We're working on a publication around the analysis of a set of word walls from around New York City, and it's been fascinating.
Oh, I can't wait to hear that, actually, because one of the things we do in our training is asking teachers to shift practice from word walls to sound walls. And it's a really hard strategy to ask someone to stop spending time on. So, and I know Mary Dahlgren and her research is a lot focused on this area, and she's amazing. So I'm glad you mentioned her too. We'll link to her work in the show notes as well.
That'd be great. I'm so fortunate to work with her on this. I was interested in how these word walls were constructed in New York, in the New York classrooms that I'm in. And then I know Louisa Motz's work on sound walls. And then I was fortunate to connect with Mary, who has really helped me think even deeper about how we could go about this. It's been great.
So exciting. So I'll really look forward to reading that research and spreading the word.
My other work, another publication I'm working on right now, goes back to this idea of the spine of your curriculum, which I had mentioned before, and having that drive and be at the forefront of everything you do around literacy instruction. So I'm hoping that I could do that, and instead of working individually with schools, I'm hoping to put out something that school leaders could read around when I talk to schools about this, and when they rethink what they have going already, how they could do this without doing some crazy overhaul, unless a crazy overhaul is needed.
Right.
And really it's your assessments that need to drive this conversation, the data that you have.
And I'm so glad you mentioned school leaders, because a lot of these discussions revolve around teacher training, pre-service or in-service. But the truth is we need our school leaders to be just as aware, if not more, about what their teachers need to know, what type of curriculums they need to choose. They are critical. I've heard them called the linchpin, really, for all the literacy instruction that goes on. And so often we leave them out of the discussion. So I love that you're bringing a focus and providing them with resources so they can learn more about how to better support their teachers and then their students.
Definitely. Yeah.
Great. Well, Dr. Miles, this has been a pleasure. I've learned so much from the conversation, and I'm so glad that we can explore your research, and thank you for spending time with us today.
I really appreciate you having me on, Jessica. Thanks so much.
To learn more about Dr. Katharine Pace Miles, you can find her at her faculty page at brooklyn.cuny.edu or visit her on Twitter at kpmilesphd. To find links to the articles and resources mentioned in this podcast, go to gleaneducation.com/podcast and access them in the show notes.